Hi, welcome back to our Bible study, and this is a bonus episode where we're looking at the theory behind the idea that the churches listed in Revelation chapter 2 and 3 are actually an example of church history, so prophesying church history. Now remember, I said that definitely, for sure, these were literal churches that existed, and these were letters written to those churches. Also, I believe that each of these churches exist today, and that we need to look at our churches and make sure that we are not falling into some of the traps that they were falling into. And also that I believe that there's Christians that can fall into these categories of the different types of Christians. So I believe all of that to be true. So I don't think in believing this theory that you then have to throw out the idea that it was literal churches. I believe both of those things can be true. All right. So we're going to look at the different stages of church history and look at it from the point of view of these different churches. So the first one would be the early church. This is the first church listed, and this would be AD 33 to 100. So remember, this is the church that lost its first love. So it was doing everything really well, and it was church planting and doing all of those things. But that it had started to forget where it came from, that it was about Jesus. So this is during this time period is when letters were written to the churches and the New Testament was written. It was the very, very end of this period when the book of Revelation was written. All right, the next one is the tribulation or the persecuted church. And remember, this is one of two churches that Jesus didn't have anything bad to say about. So this time period would have been about around AD 100 to around 300. And there were 10 waves of persecution that came through during this time period. And they were extreme persecution. Then we have AD 300 to about AD 500. And this is the doctrine of Balaam. So remember that this is, when we talked about this already, we talked about this church, that in the Old Testament, Balaam was trying to curse the Jews. And every time he cursed them, they only got blessed. And so then he came up with a different theory of going into the nation of Israel through marriage and then through bringing in idol worship, then eventually sexual sin, and that he would conquer Israel from the inside out. So remember, at first, every time he tried to curse them, they only got blessed. So if we look back at the last period, AD 100 to 300, and we have the persecuted church, that Satan is cursing them, but they just continue to grow. There was more and more churches and massive church growth during the time period of the largest amount of persecution. So now the doctrine of Balaam coming in, instead of cursing, they're going to just try to infiltrate from the inside. So this is when the last Roman Empire died during this time period, and Constantine comes to power in Rome. So at this point, he makes Christianity the state religion. So in one day, every single soldier in the Roman army was baptized and became Christian. So we understand that you can't force somebody to become Christian, because that's not how Christianity works. It is about you changing your heart. So no one can force that on you. But Constantine was just forcing Christianity on people. So what ended up happening is that it became kind of a marriage of the Roman Empire and the church. So what happened was all of the pagan temples simply got turned into Christian temples, and all the pagan priests just became Christian priests. But they obviously weren't true Christian churches, and they obviously weren't true Christian priests. They were just changing over because they were forced to by law. Also, all of the pagan festivals were just changed into Christian festivals. Now, I am not saying that we shouldn't celebrate Christmas and we shouldn't celebrate Easter and all those kinds of things because they had pagan roots. This is the time period people go back to and point that out, because obviously it's about your heart, right? And if you're celebrating Christmas because you are remembering Jesus's birth and that is why you are celebrating Christmas, then that's why you're celebrating Christmas. And if you're celebrating Easter because you are remembering Jesus' death and resurrection, and that's important to you as a Christian, then celebrate Easter. Just because we can go back to this time period and see that this is what had happened, that they had taken pagan festivals and then just turned them into Christian festivals, that doesn't mean that we just throw out our Christian festivals. I don't believe that at all. But that is what happened during this time period. Now remember, we're coming out the church being heavily persecuted. I mean, when I say during the persecuted time period, persecution was so severe, they would wrap Christians in skins of animals and then feed them to wild animals. This is where you had the Colosseums and where you would have the gladiators that would just come in and just kill all these Christians while people were all around cheering on the deaths of these Christians. They were burned alive. They were severely tortured, and their churches literally met underground. Coming out of that period and coming into this period where now Constantine is making Christianity the Roman religion, that would have been like big improvements for the church. They would have been happy about this. Now remember, the doctrine of Balaam was that the church just tolerated those things. It wasn't like the church was accepting those things, they were just kind of tolerating it. And also there's idea of, was Constantine a Christian? Constantine's wife's name was Helena, and both of them claimed to be Christians. And some people say, no, they weren't really Christians. We don't know. We know that they claimed to be Christians. And obviously they had the wrong idea as far as forcing Christianity on people, because you can't do that. All right, during this time period, what really happened was that Christianity became politicized, like became a political thing. So the church became powerful and became even more powerful than Rome. So if you wanted to have any political power, you had to have power in the church. So what ended up happening was that the church leaders were more concerned about their power and about their political power than they were concerned about their flock. But good things did happen during this time period. During this time period, instead of having a bunch of individual letters that were being passed around, the Bible was actually formed, and the Old and New Testament were put together and made into one book. So before that, there was 66 books, and at this point is when we had one book. We also had some really important councils that came during this time period in order to decide which parts of our Bible, what books of our Bible were inspired, which is all the books in our Bible, and then what books were just going to become history books. So a lot of really important things happened. But as we come to the end of this time period, the church is just, doesn't even really exist anymore. Now it's just a political power. Okay, so in AD 500 until about 1500, this is where, at this point, the Roman church is just a political power. But pretty much every throne at that point in the world was controlled by the Roman church. So even though there would be kings and queens ruling countries, it was the church behind them that was controlling them. And one of the ways they would control people is by saying that they couldn't read the Bible in their common language. So during Constantine's time, the Bible was translated into Latin, which is what people were reading at that time period. But by the time we get to this time period, people weren't reading Latin anymore. However, the Bible would only be allowed to be read in Latin. So only the priests were allowed to read it. And so they would preach whatever they wanted, and there was no way for the people to know if that was truth or not. Now, during the same time period, another religion was being formed, and that was Islam. So what happened was when Islam was formed, at first just a small group of people, and then they went to Medina, and then they set up there. And then they tried to get the Christians and the Jews to convert to Islam. So when at that point, when the Quran was just being written, so that's why you can see there's a lot of similarities actually between the Old Testament and the Quran, because they were writing it and they were trying to convert the Jews and the Christians to join them. And at that point in time, we also remember that the church was not doing so well, right? They weren't being led properly. But the church and the Christians refused to join Islam, and so what they did is they basically said, you have a choice, you can join us, or you can pay a tax, or we'll kill you. That was your three choices. So the Jews had to wear a Star of David. That was not started by Hitler, that was actually started by Islam. And then the Christians had to wear a special belt. And after they paid the tax, they would get a necklace that they could wear to prove they paid the tax. If you didn't have that necklace, then you'd be killed because you hadn't paid the tax. And they also had to bow down when they saw certain Islam people coming. So it was really bad. But what happened is, because Islam was getting all this money from the taxes, they began to grow and more people began joining, and they became a powerful force. So they were conquering all these lands. So now we have Islam, which is conquering all these lands as a political force. And then we have the church, which didn't even barely resembled the church at this point. And it was a political force. So now we have two political forces in the name of religion. And that is where we get the Crusades, because they begin to fight. And when people say the Crusades was just the church being bad, we should look at Christians as evil, the Crusades, you need to study it a little bit closer than that, because there's good things that happened in the Crusades and there's bad things that happened in the Crusades. So for instance, Jerusalem, in the first Crusade, the church, which was the church, it's the Roman church, they came and they freed Jerusalem from the hands of Islam, because remember, they had to pay the tax or they were killed. They couldn't worship in the synagogues. They couldn't have any church bells. So when they came, then they freed them. So there's good and bad things that happened during that time. Also during that time, we have the Inquisition. So anyone who tried to read the Bible for themselves or tried to pass the Bible around, that was illegal. So they were tortured and killed. And the church came up with a lot of really, really crazy things. And this was the Dark Ages. For sure, it was the Dark Ages of the church. This is the worst period in church history. Okay, so then we have AD 500 to AD 1700. Okay, so this time period is known as the Reformation period. And that is when, in the Bible, we talk about the church here. He says you have a name, but you're dead. The last one that we just talked about, where the Roman church had really taken power, and we have the Crusades and Inquisitions and the Dark Ages, that is when, in the church, when God was talking about you're like the woman Jezebel, right? So you brought in idolatry into the church and sexual immorality into the church. So that's what happened there. Now you have a name, but you're dead. So this is the Reformation period. And this is where first we have Martin Luther. So Martin Luther was studying to be a lawyer. He was hit by lightning and he survived, and he felt like that was God's call for him to go to the church. So he went to the church and began studying theology. And so because he was in the church, he was allowed to read the Bible. So he was reading the Bible, and then he was looking at what the church was teaching. He was like, this is what the Bible says, this is what the church is saying. It's not the same thing. One of the first things that he stood up against was indulgences. So this is when the church was saying, hey, if you give us money, then you can go out and you can sin. We'll give you this letter, and then then you're already forgiven for your sin. And this letter would cost like a year's wage. It was crazy. So he was seeing all these poor people giving up all their money to the church so they could be forgiven for their sin. But he said, you don't have to give your money to the church to be forgiven for your sin. You can just ask Jesus to forgive you and he'll forgive you. And the church is just stealing. So he ended up writing a list of all the things that the church was teaching that was wrong, that's not in the Bible. He nailed it to the door. And that happened. We celebrate that the day after Halloween, so Reformation Day. And that is the start of the church changing. So some really good things that happened during this time period. This is the time when the common man begins to get the Bible. So the Bible is translated into the English of the common man, and then other people get the Bible and they begin to read it. There's also the justification of grace by faith. This is what is taught during this time period, this important piece of theology that had been lost. So justification, that is when God takes off your label of sin and gives you the label of righteousness. So, example, when I teach that to children, I think this is a story that I tell. It's from What's in the Bible, by the way, a great series. So if there's say there's a girl, she comes over and she pushes this boy off his bike, and then you get the label of bad, because that is a bad action. But then if you say, well, he pushed the little boy off the bike because the boy was about to get hit by a transport truck, you would say, oh, your actions are justified. That was okay that you did that. So you take off the actions of bad and you put on the actions of good. So when we are justified, God takes off our label of sin and gives us the label of righteousness. But how are we justified? We're justified by grace. So it's not something that we deserve, by faith. So by putting our faith in Jesus Christ, in his grace, he justifies us. So this really important doctrine changed everything, and this came in during this time period. Now, what also ended up happening during this time period is we got a whole bunch of different denominations. So Menno Simons came in, which brought in Mennonites. Then we have Anabaptists, which eventually became Baptists. Basically all the Protestant faiths came during this time period, but also some cult type things began to grow during this time period. So what we have today is a whole bunch of different denominations, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I guess it means that there is a lot of, we are free to read the Bible and to study it for ourselves. But it is bad in the sense that as God says here, they have a name, but then they're dead. So there was a lot of things in the church by the end of this time period that they had all these names, all these different denominations, but then in the end, a lot of them were still dead. They still hadn't actually come to realize justification by grace through faith. So the other thing that happened during this time period for history is that a lot of the people revolted up against the church, and revolting up against the church, they revolted up against people, the landowners who were treating them basically like slaves. They began protesting for their rights. And so really the time, after the end of this time period, the world was a lot different when it came out to the end of this time period. Okay, and then we have the next church, which is the second church period that God wouldn't have condemned. We call this the open door period. So this would be the Philadelphia church, and it was from AD 1700 until 1900. So what happened during this time period is massive revival that came. This is when missionaries were sent out all over the world. During this time period is when slave trade ended. And if you want a really, really good book by Eric Metaxas, is called Amazing Grace. And he talks about this period of the church, and he talks a lot about the church during this, what the church was like and the different types of church, and how there was the true church that came up and really wanted to change the world to do things God's way, and the slave trade that ended. Also, child labor ended during this time period. And we have these great missionaries and great preachers, D.L. Moody, Charles Spurgeon, George Mueller, George Whitefield, Hudson Taylor. This is when we have a lot of our hymns that were written that we still sing today. And it was really a worldwide revival. We have, like I said, Hudson Taylor going to China. We have William Carey. We have David Livingstone. We have all of these great people. Pretty much every time God opened the door, the church ran through it and spread the good news of Jesus Christ. So when we come to the end of that, we come to the 1900 until the rapture, which is where we are living today. And this is the lukewarm church. So this is us. We have this offbeat theology. We know a lot of stuff, but then we're weak. One of the other things that happened during this time period at the beginning here, we have World War I and we have World War II. Another great book by Eric Metaxas is Bonhoeffer. And that book really talks about the church in World War II in Germany at the time. And what is happening is that Hitler would come in, he just wanted them to not teach the Old Testament because that was for the Jewish people. And then he wanted them to not allow Jewish people to have membership in their church, even if they had converted to Christianity. And then he wanted them to not teach anything written by Paul because Paul was Jewish. And you can see that slowly Hitler just erased the Bible little by little. And a lot of the churches, they just wanted to go along with it and not cause problems. And then there was another group of churches that came along that Bonhoeffer was part of that said, no, we are going to preach the Bible, and the government can't tell us what to preach and what not to preach. All right, so we have World War I, we have World War II, and then we have continuing on until today. And if you remember that church, that lukewarm church, that they were just really wealthy, really educated, and they didn't feel like there was this deep need for Jesus Christ or for Christianity or for the gospel. And this is the world that we're living in today. I know we think that there's all these pockets of poverty, and there is poverty in the world today, but we look back to the other time periods, that was everywhere. That's how everyone lived. And today we could see, especially in North America, the poorest people among us, they still have cell phones and TVs and stoves and washers and dryers. We're still living, the poorest people among us are living better than the kings and queens would have lived centuries ago. So we have this time period where we feel like we don't desperately need Jesus. And so we're just lukewarm. And our churches, a lot of us are just tolerating sin, and we're not wanting to stand up against it, and we're just becoming lukewarm. So that is the church where we are today. Another thing is, if you look at this theory of the churches, is that from the Reformation period on until the end, the period doesn't end and a new one starts, but that a new one starts and the old one continues. So we still have the things happening in the Reformation period are still happening all the way up until today. And then we still have the open door that is still happening today. There are still churches going around spreading the gospel. So that is still happening up until today. We just keep adding on. So now we have the lukewarm church that's been added on. Also, chapter 4 starts with, after these things, a door opened and the trumpet sounded. And so that is the idea of the rapture coming at the end of this time period. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get into chapter 4. So that's just this theory of church history and looking at it through the lens of these churches in Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3. I hope you found that interesting. So that was a bonus episode with a little bit of church history. And I'll see you back in the next episode where we are going to be doing Revelation chapter 4. I'm Lorelei Siemens. That was Bible Study.